He was in his late 20s when he first agreed to sit in front of a camera, his face blacked out, his voice run through a distortion filter so no one watching could ever place him. He knew what he was about to say could cost him everything, his career, his freedom, maybe his life, and he said it anyway. He claimed he had spent months inside a facility so secret it had no name on any government document, working alongside machines that, by his account, did not come from this planet. Today, that man is old. His hair has gone grey, his voice has slowed, and for the first time in more than 3 decades, he is talking about details he once refused to share. This is the story of Bob Lazar, the strange life that led him into the Nevada desert, and the questions that still refuse to die. His full name is Robert Scott Lazar, and for over 30 years he has occupied one of the strangest positions in modern American folklore. Depending on who you ask, he is either a genuine whistleblower, who exposed something the government never wanted the public to know, or he is one of the most convincing storytellers to ever sit down in front of a television crew. There isn't much middle ground. People who dig into his story tend to land firmly on one side or the other, and both camps have spent decades building their case. What keeps the argument alive is that the evidence never quite settles it. There's always just enough documentation to make dismissal feel premature, and always just enough missing to make certainty impossible. What separates Lazar from the countless others who have claimed contact with the unexplained is the nature of his claims. He never said he was abducted. He never said he received messages from another world. He described himself, consistently, as a technician, a man who worked with reactors, engines, and machinery, and who was asked to apply that same hands-on expertise to something he didn't build and didn't fully understand. His story has always been mechanical rather than mystical, and that grounded quality is part of why it has been so hard for people to simply laugh it off. When his account first became public, the backlash was immediate. Reporters and scientists alike treated him as either delusional or dishonest. Some speculated he might even be a deliberate plant, someone fed a story designed to make legitimate leaks look absurd by association. The most damaging blow to his credibility came when journalists tried to verify his education. Lazar claimed advanced degrees from 2 of the most respected technical schools in the country. When those schools were contacted, both said they had no record of him ever attending. For his critics, that was the end of the discussion. A man who lies about where he studied physics, they argued, cannot be trusted to tell the truth about anything else, let alone flying saucers. But the deeper people looked, the messier the picture became. Employment files that should have documented parts of his career could not be located. People who say they worked beside him have described searching for proof of his employment at certain institutions, only to be told no such record existed, despite some of those same people distinctly remembering him. And in the months following his public statements, things began happening around him that don't usually follow someone accused of simply making up a story. His home was broken into. Shots were fired at his car on a remote stretch of highway. He described threats serious enough that he changed the way he lived. Whatever else was going on, he did not appear to be a man enjoying newfound fame. 4 years afterward, Lazar mostly disappeared from public life. He built a private business, gave the occasional interview, and largely let the story sit without adding much to it. But something has shifted recently. As he's aged, and as public attitudes toward the topic of unidentified aerial phenomena have changed dramatically, he has become noticeably more willing to talk. Details he once left out are surfacing. Descriptions he once kept brief have gotten longer. Part of that shift seems tied to the world around him. In 1989, when he first spoke, the idea that the US government might be quietly examining something it couldn't explain sounded like pure fiction. Today, that same government has publicly acknowledged encounters with objects that defy conventional explanation, released footage from military pilots, and testified before Congress about aircraft that outperform anything in the known arsenal of any nation. The ground underneath his original claims has shifted, and Lazar, aware that he has fewer years ahead of him than behind him, appears to have decided it's time to say more. To understand why so many people still take him seriously, and why others remain convinced he invented the whole thing, it helps to go back to where his story actually starts, long before Nevada, long before the hidden facility, to a kid in Florida who liked taking machines apart just to see what made them work. Robert Lazar was born in 1959 in Coral Gables, a quiet, sun-baked suburb near Miami. By most accounts from people who knew him as a boy, he wasn't a casually curious kid. He was intensely, almost compulsively focused on machinery. Where other children might pull a radio apart and abandon the pieces on the floor, Lazar rebuilt what he took apart into something different, something that hadn't existed in that form before. He gravitated toward propulsion specifically, the physics of how something with the right combination of fuel and design could be made to leave the ground. As a teenager, he built working rockets in his family's garage, packing his own propellant and machining components while neighbors watched with a mix of concern and fascination. That alone would have made him an unusually gifted hobbyist. But he went further. He built functioning jet engines, teaching himself welding and fabrication in the process, and he didn't stop at building them, he mounted them on things. Later in life, this same obsession produced a jet-powered car capable of speeds that reportedly got the attention of highway patrol, and a jet-powered bicycle he rode down public roads. This was someone who didn't just read about engineering as a subject. He lived inside it. That detail matters, because it says something about how his mind worked long before Nevada ever entered the picture. By every account of his early life, Lazar was a genuine hands-on experimentalist, someone who understood machines as physical, dangerous, living things rather than abstract theory on a page. After high school he moved to California and attended Pierce College, a community college in the San Fernando Valley. This is where the tidy version of his story starts to unravel, and where his critics have planted their strongest objections. Because Lazar would later claim graduate degrees from two of the most prestigious technical universities in the United States, one in electronics, one in physics. When reporters checked, neither school had any record of him. No transcripts, no professors who remembered him, nothing. To skeptics, this has always been the single most damaging fact in the entire case. If he fabricated his academic background, why trust anything else he says? Lazar's own explanation has remained consistent for over 30 years. He claims his records were deliberately scrubbed as part of the same secrecy apparatus that, according to him, erased his time working on classified projects. It's a convenient explanation, and critics are quick to point out that the missing evidence is itself the evidence of a cover-up is exactly the kind of circular reasoning a fabricated story would rely on. But then there's Los Alamos. This is where the simple explanation, that Lazar invented his entire background, starts to run into real trouble. A preserved 1982 internal telephone directory from Los Alamos National Laboratory, one of the most secure scientific facilities in the country, lists a Robert Lazar as a staff technician. That's not something an ordinary person could plant after the fact, it's an internal lab document. That same year, a local New Mexico newspaper ran a feature on him, describing him as a physicist and photographing him next to a jet-powered car he'd built, the same restless engineering habit from his Florida childhood, now grown into something that could hit the open highway. The paper called him a scientist working at the lab. And yet when journalists later asked Los Alamos directly about his employment, the lab denied he had ever worked there. Some former colleagues have said publicly, years later, that they do remember him. How a name ends up printed in an internal staff directory and a local newspaper story, only for the institution to later deny any employment relationship, is a question that has never been cleanly answered by either side of the argument. It's into that unresolved gap that, according to Lazar, a specific and historically significant figure entered his life. Around 1988, he says he received a phone call from Dr. Edward Teller, the physicist widely known for his central role in developing the hydrogen bomb, and one of the most influential figures in 20th-century American defense science. According to Lazar, the two had crossed paths once before at Los Alamos, when Teller noticed him reading the very newspaper article that had featured his jet car, and stopped to ask if the photograph was really him. Years later, Lazar says, that same voice was on the phone, asking whether he was still looking for work. He was told only that there was a classified propulsion project, and that a further contact would explain the details. What followed, in his account, was the machinery of extreme classification, interviews, fingerprinting, security paperwork far more extensive than anything in an ordinary job, and instructions to fly not to a base with a familiar name, but to Las Vegas, where he'd be taken somewhere that didn't officially exist. That somewhere wasn't Area 51 itself, according to Lazar, though it's often confused with it. He describes a separate site roughly 15 miles south of the famous Groom Lake Test Range, near a dry lake bed known as Papoose Lake, at a facility he refers to by the designation S4. In his telling, S4 wasn't a conventional building at all. It was built directly into a mountainside, with massive hangar doors textured and colored to blend seamlessly with the surrounding rock, invisible from the air or from any distance. He describes buses with blacked-out windows carrying workers in, armed security at every turn, and an atmosphere so tense that employees avoided even casual conversation, let alone questions about what they were doing there. Then came what he has described as the turning point of his life. He was led into a hangar and shown a disc roughly 40 feet across. What struck him first, he says, wasn't its shape but its surface, no rivets, no welds, no visible seams anywhere, as if the entire object had been formed as a single continuous piece of material. His first assumption, as an experienced builder of machines himself, was that he was looking at an extremely advanced human aircraft, a classified prototype far beyond anything publicly known. That assumption, he says, didn't survive the briefing documents he was given. Rather than describing a single experimental craft, the paperwork referenced a group of distinct vehicles, varying in size and shape, described in flat administrative language, as being of non-terrestrial origin. Some, according to what he read, had reportedly been recovered from crash sites. The particular craft assigned to him, nicknamed the Sport Model by the small team working there because of its sleek, compact shape, became the subject of his most detailed and most scrutinized testimony. He described a spherical reactor about the size of a basketball positioned at the center of the craft, powered by a substance unlike anything catalogued on the periodic table at the time, which he referred to as element 115. According to his description, bombarding a stable form of that element with protons triggered a transformation that released enormous amounts of energy through matter-antimatter interaction, energy that wasn't used for thrust in any conventional sense, but instead to generate a field capable of distorting space directly around the craft, allowing it to move without traditional propulsion. At the time, this claim was treated as pure invention. Antimatter power generation didn't exist in any practical form, gravity manipulation had no basis in established physics, and element 115 simply wasn't a recognized element. Then, in 2003, scientists successfully synthesized element 115 in a laboratory, for the first time, 14 years after Lazar had named it publicly. His supporters point to that timing as remarkable, arguing it would be an extraordinary coincidence for someone fabricating a story to name a real, not yet discovered element. Skeptics counter that it's exactly that, a coincidence, or an educated guess based on gaps in the periodic table that were already known to physicists at the time. Over the following decades, Lazar has maintained several pieces of documentation that his supporters treat as partial corroboration. A W-2 tax form listing an obscure government entity as his employer for the period he says he worked at S4, along with the earlier Los Alamos directory listing and newspaper photograph that predate his public claims by years. None of these documents, on their own, prove the more extraordinary parts of his story. But they do complicate the simplest explanation, that he manufactured the entire account from nothing. His personal life since then has not been the story of someone chasing fame. He built a private business, largely avoided the media circuit for long stretches, faced a legal case he and his supporters have characterized as unrelated to his UFO claims, and later experienced a federal search of his business that he has suggested was connected to the very substance at the center of his original story. Friends who say they accompanied him to observe activity near the test range in the years after his claims became public have described watching unexplained lights and aircraft-like objects moving in ways they could not otherwise account for. In recent years, the broader conversation around unidentified aerial phenomena has changed substantially. Government officials have publicly confirmed the existence of a program dedicated to studying such objects, released footage recorded by military pilots, and acknowledged in congressional testimony that the U.S. does not fully understand the origin or capability of everything appearing in restricted airspace. For a man who was dismissed and ridiculed for saying something similar decades earlier, that shift has been described as both vindicating and frustrating, an acknowledgement that stops just short of confirming the specific details he has spent his life describing. None of this proves Bob Lazar's account is true. Independent verification of the most extraordinary claims, the disks, the reactor, the antimatter propulsion, simply doesn't exist outside of his own testimony and the handful of documents that place him near classified government work. What can be said is that his story has remained remarkably consistent for more than 3 decades, that elements of it intersect with verifiable historical records in ways that are difficult to fully explain away, and that he has never appeared to profit significantly from maintaining it. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a man describes a substance years before science manages to create it, keeps a tax document that would be unusually specific for a fabricated story, and spends 30 years repeating the same account without ever cashing in on it, what does that add up to? Is it the pattern of an elaborate, carefully maintained fabrication, or is it the outline of something genuinely inconvenient that never quite got fully confirmed or fully debunked? Share what you think in the comments, and why.